Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
It's a great privilege to welcome back to this program, and it's been a while. We are so psyched that he could be with us. Jamelle Bouie is the Chief Political Correspondent for Slate Magazine. You can read his work online at slate.com, and Jamelle joins us live on the program. Jamelle Bouie, how are you, sir? Thank you for being with us.
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for having me.
So let us start with Charlottesville. And your thoughts, your reactions. You and I have not had a chance to speak since the events of August 11th and 12th and the tragic murder of Heather Heyer, the serious bodily injury, emotional injury to many, many others here in Charlottesville during the altercation of what was billed as a Unite the Right rally, which brought together members of the disparate groups under the heading of the alt-right who were rallying with Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan here in Charlottesville that weekend. Jamelle, talk about this for a few minutes in terms of what were your takeaways, and what do you think is really important that we keep in mind as we struggle, especially here locally, to make sense of the inexplicable horror that this community experienced?
Right. So I think with regards to the actual Unite the Right, alt-right crowd, I think what it's worth keeping in mind is that it was significant that they felt so comfortable protesting in that manner without any sort of covering, without anything to sort of hide or obscure their identities. I think it speaks to a sense that the atmosphere for that kind of rhetoric is a bit more friendly than it was in the recent past. And I also think that one thing worth considering is that, you know, I was there reporting, and although most of the folks I encountered and talked to were from out of town or from other areas of the country, there were a handful of people from Virginia. I'm sure there was a handful of folks there. I mean, Jason Kessler is from Charlottesville, and I think that there's a temptation at times to downplay the extent to which there are people within the community who may hold these views. And I think that we should remember that that's not the case, that there are folks in this community that hold those views, and this wasn't an entirely foreign imposition on Charlottesville. So that's just with regards to the Unite the Right crowd. You know, moving forward from the events of August 12, it's sort of difficult. It's somewhat difficult to say what the takeaway from all of this is, or what lessons should be drawn, or what lessons should be learned. I think one thing to consider, to think about, is the extent to which that protest really did put in stark relief the conflict over the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues in Charlottesville. And for my part, I think that the fact that those were the rallying sites for the alt-right actually helps illuminate what those statues stand for. And if that, I think that's always been the case, but if that wasn't the case, then now it certainly is. And as Charlottesville moves forward with the debate over the statues, I think that should be kept in mind, that those structures are rallying points for some very ugly forces.
We're talking with Jamelle Bouie. He is the chief political correspondent for Slate Magazine. Jamelle, it's interesting you mentioned that the Charlottesville community really should own the fact that there were people here who made that rally happen and who were part of the violence and part of the sentiment, and it wasn't all outsiders, as you say. And it reminds me that during the civil rights movement, during the student movement and peace movement in the 50s and in the 60s, when we saw protests and rallies in Charlottesville, there was often this media narrative that, Charlottesville really doesn't feel that way. Those are outsiders. Those are rabble-rousers who've come into our community to stir things up and to change things, and we wish they would just go away so that we could stay the same. And we see the same thing happening now. Well, most of those people weren't from Charlottesville, and while that is true, I find it very interesting that it really is the same kind of narrative that, this isn't us. This is people from elsewhere.
I think there is an extent to which in Charlottesville, and I say this as someone who went to the University of Virginia, who's been coming into Charlottesville for some time, recently relocated back here. So I wouldn't say I am sort of like an insider here, but I certainly am, I think, pretty familiar with the city and with the area. And there's an extent to which Charlottesville's beauty, its reputation for being a nice place, obscures the very real fractures and divisions within the community. And so there's a certain perspective by which you could not notice how those aesthetic features of the town obscure those divisions. And so if they're obscured to you, then it's easy to say, well, this isn't Charlottesville, but it very much is. To go back to the statues, those statues are themselves indicative of a time in the not-too-distant past when public racism was a fact of life in Charlottesville. So that all that is part of the city's heritage. And I would hope that in the wake of August 12th, we could have more forthright conversations about that.
What was your reaction as somebody who's moved back to town, as an alumnus of the university, to see those guys marching on the lawn with their torches and screaming the racist obscenities and screaming the literal Nazi slogans and Jews will not replace us? And then, of course, they rally around the Jefferson statue, which was the work and the gift of a Jewish artist, but they didn't know that. But as an alumnus, I'm curious, did you have what were your thoughts and reaction to that of the night of August 11th?
I mean, I found it personally very disturbing, not just the imagery and the actual protest from the alt-right figures, but just the extent to which the university simply dropped the ball and left those students, I think, at a real risk of physical danger. Watching that as unplayed via video online, I was just very shocked that the university wasn't prepared for that. To sort of zoom out a little to, I guess, like a thematic view of it, to me that both illustrated so much of the conflict here. The fact that the people defending the Thomas Jefferson statue, pushing back against those racist protesters, were students of different races and religions, trying to embody the best of what the university in which Charlottesville stands for. Doing so, in front of a statue of such a a figure like Jefferson, who has both the admirable side that we talked about quite a bit, and also the more troubling aspects of his legacy. And all taken together, you have sort of a perfect picture of, I think, the conflicts at work here. But to bring it back to just the ground level stuff, I thought I both was very proud of the students and faculty who were there counter protesting against the alt-right folks, and very disturbed that they basically left vulnerable to violence and harm.
Jamelle, your beat really is national politics, and so let's turn our attention to the reaction that you saw on the national stage in the wake of Charlottesville. The president's sort of reaction, his gut reaction, which insisted on some really, in my words, I guess, a false moral equivalency between those who stood for fascism on August 12th and those who stood up against it. And the political parties and political leaders, what did and didn't we see in the wake of Charlottesville on the national stage, you think?
What we didn't see, obviously, was from the president sort of a firm statement against the outright protesters. On that Saturday, the president said something to the effect of there was violence on both sides, or many sides were responsible for the violence in Charlottesville, which I think most on the ground takes say that's just not the case. He gave a subsequent statement that was better, but then he gave a third statement that not only recapitulated the many sides talk, but also offered a kind of defense of the alt-right protesters, which was very disturbing, and I think indicative of this president's sort of larger commitments, we'll say. But he was sort of alone in that stance. Most figures in the Republican Party spoke out strongly against what happened in Charlottesville, certainly most figures in the Democratic Party. What I found interesting about everything was how I don't think that Republican politicians have necessarily made the connection between the explicit racism seen in Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th, but also the kinds of policies like strict voter ID laws, which have been attacked as the kind of voter suppression sort of effort to disenfranchise on local level, very sort of laws that struck down by the Supreme Court for that reason. Not seeing a connection between those two things, and not even really sensing the connection between that, the fact that those people felt empowered to protest in Charlottesville, and last year's presidential election when the president, if he didn't court some of these figures, at the very least, winked in their direction, or didn't disavow their support, as we saw when he was asked to disavow David Duke. And so, I would hope, and I'm doing a lot of hoping here, but I would hope that Republican politicians who were appalled by the president's behavior in the wake of Charlottesville would begin to draw those connections.
Jamelle, I've read online some reactions in social media, and I share the sentiment that the kind of emotional, angry, populist appeals that we see in the alt-right, it's eerily similar to what we see among the young men in ISIS. That they're angry, they're afraid, but most of all, they feel like their own cultural identity is under assault, and that they have to become soldiers in some kind of war to protect the identity of their, in their mind, I guess, their religion, their heritage, their homeland, and they really want to go out and look for a fight in that war. If the fight doesn't come to them, they want to go find it. And I'm sure you've come across similar stuff. Is that a valid comparison? And if so, what does it say about the world today?
That's a really interesting question. You look at, let's say, Dylan Roof, who was responsible for the shooting at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston in 2015 that killed 9 people. Dylan Roof's path to that event is actually remarkably similar to the kinds of radicalization we've seen from lone wolf attackers associated with ISIS. Young men, sometimes educated, sometimes not. In Roof's case, he wasn't, but almost always young men, disaffected, looking for meaning, looking for community of some sort, drawn to ideologies that provide sort of systematic explanations for the world, like closed systems that they can understand in full. And then for whatever reason, sometimes it may be sort of mental illness. Other times it just may be a basic kind of personality susceptibility to wanting to use violence. That combination of things sets the stage for a willingness to use violence. So I think in that sense, there is something there. There is a connection there. You could kind of make a similar case if you want to go back 20 years with Timothy Mcveigh, who, again, a young man, alienated, looking for meaning, sort of taken in by a kind of a totalizing ideology that then gave fuel for sort of like antisocial impulses. I don't know the degree to which that characterizes the young men who were at Unite the Right. Honestly, part of me thinks that some of them were basically playing dress-up, if that makes any sense, that this was transgressive, it upset people they don't like, and so it was all sort of fun and games, and that's not all of them. There are definitely in that crowd serious, like hardcore ideological racists, but a 20-year-old or 21-year-old who comes waving, some sort of quasi-Nazi flag that he dreamed up. There's definitely some hate there, but I also think there's this odd sense of feeling like this is just it's a transgressive thing to do. And what will be interesting to see going forward is I don't think any of those people expected someone to die that Saturday, and now that someone has, will they continue to see this as being transgressive, like a kind of dress-up, or will they see it as serious as it is?
It's an excellent point you make, and it crossed my mind when I was out driving around that afternoon and saw, I just call it a squad, of a group of those guys walking around, and there were some young women with them. It struck me as a group that looked like they were going to a Renaissance fair, and to bang their swords together. It really looked like that to me, and so I fully understand how you're describing that there were some in there who might have shared that sentiment, and then of course, thanks to the Vice documentary, which was so masterfully done and included those sort of behind-the-scenes exclusive interviews with one of their leaders, we know that certainly not all of them felt that way. Some of them were absolutely focused on inflicting the most harm possible, and at least one guy that they interviewed on the Vice, Cantwell, I think, his name is, who's in jail now, was absolutely dedicated to bringing death, and said, what's the quote, "More people will die here before we're done." Right.
So yeah, I don't want to overstate the degree to which some of that crowd might have been, young men who thought this was all a game. There are guys like Cantwell, guys like Spencer, those, they hold these beliefs sincerely. And it should be said that ultimately what you believe is a function of what you do. And so if you're playing pretend with Nazi imagery, eventually that's indistinguishable from just like being a Nazi.
We're talking with Jamelle Bouie. He is the Chief Political Correspondent for Slate Magazine. Jamelle, to change gears here and to pick up with the line that you just shared, what you believe is what you do. What are we to make then of the beliefs of the Trump administration? What are they doing? What are you watching closely? What's on your radar? I know you've written recently about the Sessions Department of Justice. What are they doing and not doing that expresses a real belief system on which they act, irregardless of the spin and the PR and the messaging campaign that they're constantly exerting in the media? What do they do that expresses the belief?
Well, the first thing, and I should say that's most striking, is that when it comes to legislative affairs, when it comes to trying to advance an agenda, the Trump administration has just been remarkably, it's been a remarkable failure. It's September, it's after Labor Day. We're 8 months into the Trump administration, into the first year, and there hasn't been a single piece of major legislation passed by Congress and signed by the president. There's not even a piece of legislation in progress to be signed by the president. So for comparison's sake, by this time in his presidency, Barack Obama had signed the stimulus package, had signed a couple smaller bills, and was really working towards passing healthcare reform. And I'll grant that was a special circumstance, that Democrats had a larger majority than Republicans do now, and kind of the atmosphere of the financial crisis really gave juice to the Obama administration as it pursued its agenda. But still, there are sort of numbers on the board, if you want to put it that way. George W. Bush in 2001, by this point, had already signed his first round of tax cuts and was working with Democrats to get No Child Left Behind passed and signed, and would, in fact, sign that bill at the beginning of 2002. Bill Clinton, at this point, had signed a major budget bill that included a substantial tax increase and an expansion in various social programs, and it was preparing for a healthcare battle. So it's unusual that we're at this point in a presidency and kind of nothing legislatively has been done. And so I think it's first important to say that the defining sort of element of the Trump administration at this point is just kind of dysfunction and disarray. That said, where the administration has been aggressive, where it has had sort of a well-defined agenda, is in fulfilling the promises from the campaign that were focused on immigration restrictionism, that were focused on bringing agencies like ICE to bear on immigrant communities, that was focused on pushing back against the Obama administration's attempts to reform police departments. All of that has been moving with very little friction, and has been, if you share those goals, quite effective. So looking at that, looking at the president's own rhetoric, I think what you can say in terms of what it's doing and what that tells us about the character of the administration is that it's not really accomplishing much substantive, but it has been quite successful in rolling back the administrative and bureaucratic and law enforcement legacy of the Obama administration, and thus fulfilling that part of Trump's appeal to his supporters.
And it's completely at odds with the narrative that we got about Trump from his supporters during the campaign, and since that, here is a can-do guy. He's going to run government like a business, and there's no businessman better than him. So he's going to get in there and and hire the best people and make things happen. And there's you've never seen anything like this. Just get ready and hold on to your hat, because he's going to make America great again.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that running government is actually a job. I mean, it sounds like it should be obvious, but there's being president requires actual specialized skills that you don't just have by virtue of doing business. And so, if we grant the idea that Donald Trump was an unusually successful businessman, and that I think is contestable given his actual business record, if we grant that, and grant that he was a successful and capable businessman, there's nothing about that guarantees you'll be able to do the job of president, which doesn't just involve managing a federal bureaucracy, but also involves making alliances with congressional leaders. It involves maneuvering around and through various interests, both within and without your party. It requires building a connection with the broad public and utilizing public opinion to advance your goals. And it requires the ability to compromise. It requires the ability to be patient. It requires the ability to quickly absorb and deploy sort of specialized and sometimes esoteric knowledge. It's not an easy job, as evidenced by the fact that there are very few presidents who we can say did, an especially good job of it. And so the fact that, I don't think anyone should be surprised, even if you voted for Trump and hope that he succeeds. I don't think anyone should be surprised that 8 months into it, someone who has no experience with politics, with the challenges and give and take and difficulties of politics, someone who has no experience with that is struggling to run his administration.
I've heard it said that the left should take solace in the fact that he is so bad at his job that there's not much they have to worry about because he really can't get anything done.
So I don't think that's necessarily the case, just because again, once you step away from the legislative side of things, the side that requires Congress, on the administrative level, the Trump administration has been successful in rolling back some Obama-era initiatives. Agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and the in Housing and Urban Development have not just seen large personnel losses, but are actively sort of moving away from Obama-era initiatives with land preservation or climate change or anti-discrimination in housing. Agencies like the Department of Education have basically abandoned efforts to regulate for-profit colleges and for-profit college lenders. So on that side of things, the Trump administration is moving along quite well. And so the notion that, he's not really doing anything, I'm not quite sure is the case. He's doing stuff. It's just stuff that's not obvious. But legislatively, at least, it's absolutely true that his administration is largely slowed to a standstill. What
does it say about the Republican Party that he's been so effective at just pissing them all off and making the folks who should be working with him and helping to make things happen for their agenda, he has repeatedly attacked them, and most recently, I guess, relied on the on Democrats to work with him on occasion. What does it say about the right?
I mean, I think what it says. There's a whole book to be written about what it says, but
and we're looking forward to you writing it, Jamelle.
But I think you can say a couple things. The first is that I think just the elevation of Donald Trump says a lot about how at least Republican voters have adopted a disdain for expertise so dramatic that many are willing to accept someone who has, again, no relevant skills or no apparent skills for the job of president and elevate them to the presidency. I think the fact that despite having sort of majorities in both the House and the Senate, Republicans have not been able to advance an agenda or a legislative agenda, says a lot about how the policy-making skills within the Republican Party have atrophied since 2008, when during George W. Bush's final year in office. It is striking that even the people lauded as policy, wonks, people who should know how to do this, like Paul Ryan, have been largely impotent in the face of internal division and the broad unpopularity of their agenda. Mitch McConnell's reputation is built around his ability, his tactical brilliance, his ability to get legislation through Congress, and he's been unable to do that. Maybe those reputations were overstated, but I do think it reveals quite a bit about how the Republican Party, as currently constituted, is able to win elections, but doesn't really seem to know what to do when it has the power. It's like the proverbial dog that caught the car.
My friend Sean Kenney, who will be in here in the next hour, who's the former director of the Republican Party of Virginia and was the first leading Republican in Virginia who on my television program came out against Trump last year, March of last year, I think, even before Trump got the nomination, and spoke out against him and campaigned against him, has said that, and I wanted to get your reaction to this, Sean has said that the real skeleton key to understanding the right today is to appreciate the extent to which everything that animates them, motivates them, drives them, is at its core is about hurting the left. That it really isn't about achieving goals and principles and big policy ideas, and it truly comes down to, will this make those liberals angry? And if so, I'm all for it. And so that perhaps is why we see the young conservative men in Charlottesville chanting, "Russia is our friend." One wonders what President Reagan might have thought about that. What are your thoughts on that? This idea that the right has just become the anti-left?
So there's this phenomena in political science, what political scientists talk about, called negative partisanship. And basically what it means is that for an increasing number of voters, they're less motivated to vote for their side as much as they are to vote against the other side. And it's part of what helps explain the remarkably high levels of sort of partisan allegiance during an election. So Donald Trump won something like 90% of Republicans in last year's election, which is about typical for recent presidential contests. And this is despite not really having any ties to the Republican Party, expressing views that are antithetical to mainstream Republican politicians, having quite a few prominent Republicans speak out against him. Despite all of that, he still won the vast majority of Republicans. So I think it's exactly right that sort of what's part of what's motivating this is a greater interest in angering Democrats and liberals than advancing a particular agenda. And it's worth saying that there isn't quite the same, there's negative partisanship on the left as well, but it's not to the same extent, not to the same degree. Democratic politicians still feel the need to advance a positive agenda and still campaign and try to distinguish between themselves on that positive agenda. It's unclear to me that a Democratic politician could get by just by saying he's going to stick it to Republicans. There's no example of that thus far, although it's entirely possible that you could develop, over the next decade or 2 decades or however, or even the next election cycle. But for now, at least, this, I think, constitutes a kind of asymmetry between the parties. Negative partisanship, again, exists on both sides, but it seems to be just for Republicans that the driving force is anti-liberalism and anti-democratic. And part of me wonders if that isn't a function of just the differing media landscapes and media ecosystems for both sides. There is no Democratic equivalent to Fox News. There is no Democratic equivalent to Rush Limbaugh. There is no force among Democrats media force, mind you, that will discipline harshly a Democrat who votes the wrong way or who doesn't support a Democratic president. That just doesn't exist in the same way. And I do wonder if that isn't accelerating some of these trends that sort of existed before them, but have certainly gotten very strong in the past decade or so.
Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent for Slate Magazine. Jamelle, you mentioned the media. Take a moment to reflect on journalists, journalism, the media in today's America in this first quarter of the 21st century, and connect those dots to the Jefferson vision that there was a real role for the free press, as he called it, what we today might call journalists or the media, in helping to educate a citizenry to support the institutions and the ideals of a constitutional republic. And I know this is a big drone view here of this landscape, and certainly the words that he used, citizen, public, they have all expanded thanks to successive generations of founders who have moved this country closer to its ideals, and hopefully will continue to do so. But that founding principle that there is a role for journalists in the well-being and the future health of a democracy. What are your thoughts on that as a student, a former student of the University of Virginia and a student of Jefferson, and as a journalist today?
I mean, I think it's, the free press is a necessary part of a democracy. We need it. I don't think you can really do democracy without one. I think that what journalists face at this moment and have faced for the past, 15 years is just a dramatic decrease in the trust in the institution of journalism. There's a reason why the fake news charge resonated with so many Americans. Many Americans believe that journalists are kind of just constantly lying. And as someone within the field, I find this sort of bewildering because every single journalist I know is among the most scrupulous, people I've ever met, working very hard to get stories right. But I think there is this profound loss in trust that mirrors the loss in trust in other institutions, and not to cast journalists as completely innocent here. Journalism has made major failures in the last 15 years that would sort of make people less trusting. At the same time, there is like a concerted movement to discredit journalists. The fake news declaration to the president is one of them. Those are echoed throughout conservative media. And I'll say, I think some of the distrust is a function of cable news. It's interesting to me, just both as a journalist and as someone who interviews ordinary people and talks to ordinary people quite frequently, people will talk to me, a journalist, and rail against the media while talking to a member of the media. And I think when people say the media, they mean a lot of things, but one of the things they definitely mean is cable news media, which is sensationalist, which is not often, but sometimes inaccurate or sometimes exaggerates the facts of the matter. And I do wonder how much the ubiquity of cable news media has shaped folks.
Jamelle, before I let you go, Robert Mueller's investigation of the Trump administration, the campaign, his team. There are some reporters out there and talking heads who say, we don't need any more smoking guns. It's all right in front of you. And others who are saying, well, there's a lot of smoke but no fire yet. Do you expect charges, and how do you think it's going to play out? What's your crystal ball tell you?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. My sort of default stance here is that there's going to be a lot of information. There already is a lot of information that is sketchy, that suggests impropriety, that even if it isn't illegal per se, it's certainly unethical. I think we'll continue to see that kind of material, but I'm not sure there'll be ever be a smoking gun, something to say, look, definitively, the president did something illegal. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what we'll have basically is a strong case that the president, as a candidate, acted carelessly and potentially unethically. And I do think that even it says something about our political climate that isn't going to spur any concrete action. That in the absence of illegality, I think the president, is secure in his position.
Safe to say that a Republican Congress already would have brought impeachment charges against Hillary Clinton if the shoe was on the other foot, I suppose.
I think there's a pretty decent chance that's true.
Jamelle Bouie, he's at Slate Magazine, the chief political correspondent, and make sure that you check out his work, bookmark it, read it as often as you can, doing some terrific reporting that is must-reading, and it is all to be found at slate.com. Jamelle, thank you, sir, for your time and all the work that you do, and we look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.